Marcelo Paterno has spent his entire working life growing coffee on his farm in the Campos Altos region of Minas Gerais. And in recent years, he's started talking about his own trees the way you talk about something already lost. It's a disaster, he told Global Coffee Report, standing among fields that any experienced coffee grower could look at and immediately understand we're never going to produce a normal harvest again anytime soon. This past harvest, he got less than half of what he'd normally expect, less even than what he managed to pull in during the harvest that followed the historic 2021 frost that devastated Brazil's coffee industry. And when you look at these fields, he said, it's obvious to anyone who knows coffee that the next harvest is going to be even worse. That's not a forecast. That's a farmer standing in his own fields, watching a slow-motion disaster unfold across a landscape he's spent his entire life tending. Today, we're going to walk through the real human and economic story behind Brazil's recurring winter frost crisis, why it keeps happening, why it keeps getting worse, and what it actually means for an industry and a global commodity that touches hundreds of millions of people every single morning. Subscribe to the channel before we get into this one, because I dig into exactly this kind of story, the ones where a distant weather event turns out to have a direct, tangible line running all the way to something as ordinary as your own morning routine. Let's start with the scale of what's actually at stake here, because I don't think most people fully grasp just how concentrated global coffee production really is. Brazil produces roughly 35 to 40% of the entire world's coffee supply, a staggering share for any single country to hold over a global commodity this deeply woven into daily life across dozens of cultures. And within Brazil itself, that production concentrates even further into a specific highland belt across Minas Gerais, Paraná, and São Paulo, exactly the elevation and climate conditions the prized Arabica variety needs to thrive, and exactly the conditions that leave those same plantations sitting directly in the path of a recurring, genuinely brutal winter hazard, frost sweeping up out of the far south. The mechanism behind that frost carries its own kind of quiet, terrifying elegance once you understand it. Sucafina's weather strategist has described the specific combination of factors required: polar, blocking wind patterns capable of dislodging cold air from the South Pole and directing it thousands of miles north toward South America, combined with high pressure and low dew points that let temperatures crash overnight with nothing to hold the heat in. The description from one of the historically significant frost events decades ago captured the visceral experience of it arriving, striking in the pre-dawn light, wilting leaves and leaving blossoms stillborn on the branch, leaving behind a lifeless, browned swath marking exactly where the cold had passed by the time morning finally revealed the damage. There's something genuinely haunting about that image, a disaster with no wind, no rain, no dramatic footage of destruction in progress, just cold air settling silently over a landscape in the dark, and farmers waking up to find their livelihood changed before they'd even had their morning coffee. Let's walk through the human toll of this, because the historical pattern here isn't a story about a single bad year. It's a story about a community absorbing repeated escalating blows across decades, each one landing on ground that hadn't fully recovered from the last. The 1975 frost, still referred to by industry veterans as the Black Frost, remains one of the most catastrophic agricultural disasters in the history of global coffee, an event whose scale reshaped the Oasentau industry and drove years of elevated prices as growers worked through a recovery that took considerably longer than anyone initially expected. A similarly devastating event struck again in 1994. Then, in July 2021, following a prolonged drought that had already left trees stressed and weakened, a frost hit that analysts described as the most severe damage to Brazil's coffee regions in over 40 years, with early loss estimates around 3.5 million bags concentrated specifically in the Sul de Minas and Cerrado regions, the same areas that would go on to bear the brunt of further damage in the years that followed. And then came 2025, when Brazil's coffee belt endured something genuinely unprecedented in recent memory. Not one frost event, but 3 separate intense cold fronts striking the same key growing regions within a single year. Maya Wallengren, an analyst with roughly 4 decades of direct experience covering this exact market, offered a genuinely striking historical comparison. In her entire career, she said, only twice in 100 years had frost occurred this late in the season with damage severe enough to affect coffee grown even further north than the traditionally most vulnerable regions. But her deeper concern wasn't really about the visible, physical damage from any single one of those 3 fronts. It was about what she called the stress impact on the trees themselves heading into the next flowering season, an impact she argued was massively more severe than what growers had faced even during the historic 2021 frost, precisely because most Brazilian coffee growers simply hadn't recovered from what she described as 5 straight years of nonstop weather disasters before this latest sequence even began. I want you to genuinely sit with what that means for someone like Marcelo Paterno, or any of the thousands of farming families across Minas Gerais, Paraná, and São Paulo living through this same recurring nightmare. This isn't a single catastrophic event followed by a clean recovery period the way a hurricane or a wildfire might unfold. It's a slow, grinding, compounding crisis where a farm that survives one frost enters the next season already weakened, more vulnerable, running on considerably less resilience than it had going into the previous threat. An industry where the growth cycle from planting or major pruning to full productive harvest can take years, meaning there's often no fast way to simply replant and recover even when a farmer has the resources to try. Paterno's own words capture this compounding reality with a bluntness that's genuinely hard to sit with. This past harvest yielding less than half of normal, less even than what came in the year after 2021's historic frost, and looking at his own fields, already able to see that the next harvest is shaping up to be worse still. Let's follow this story out from the farm and into the global market, because the ripple effects of what's happening on the ground in Brazil reach considerably further than most. People realize coffee futures markets have repeatedly demonstrated an almost immediate, visceral sensitivity to frost reports out of Brazil, with prices posting sharp movements purely on forecast risk, sometimes well before any actual damage has even been confirmed on the ground through the days or weeks of field assessment that a genuine damage evaluation actually requires. That volatility isn't market overreaction. It's an honest reflection of just how little slack exists elsewhere in global coffee production to absorb a significant loss out of Brazil without meaningfully affecting the price everyone downstream eventually pays: roasters, cafes, grocery stores, and ultimately the person standing in their kitchen each morning deciding how much their daily cup is going to cost them this year compared to last. There's also a genuinely complicated trade dimension layered directly on top of this weather story that deserves real attention because it shows how a purely meteorological crisis can get tangled up with entirely separate economic and political forces in ways that compound the underlying uncertainty. Recent tariff actions affecting U.S. imports of Brazilian coffee have added an additional, distinct layer of market pressure on top of the weather-driven supply risk, since American roasters and importers, facing both a weather-constrained supply out of Brazil and new barriers to accessing whatever supply does exist, may increasingly need to shift toward alternative origins like Colombia, Central America, or East Africa. Those alternative sources typically carry higher price differentials, meaning that even the act of diversifying away from a weather-damaged Brazilian supply carries its own real cost, one that ultimately flows through the entire chain from grower to consumer, regardless of which specific link in that chain absorbs it first. I think what makes this entire story genuinely worth understanding, beyond just its immediate economic stakes, is what it reveals about the growing gap between how resilient an agricultural system was built to be and how much stress it's actually now being asked to absorb. Brazil's coffee industry has weathered severe frost events before 1975, 1994, and recovered over years, sometimes the better part of a decade, but it recovered. What analysts are increasingly flagging now is a landscape entering each new winter carrying considerably more accumulated vulnerability than it did going into any single previous crisis, a cumulative weight of repeated droughts, hailstorms, and now consecutive years of frost events, each one landing on ground that hadn't finished healing from whatever came before it. That's a genuinely different kind of crisis than a single isolated disaster, however catastrophic, because it doesn't offer the same clear before and after recovery arc. It's an ongoing, grinding erosion of resilience playing out across an industry responsible for feeding one of the world's most universal daily habits. Let's talk about what the actual damage assessment process looks like on the ground, because it's genuinely worth understanding as part of the human story here, not just an abstract technical detail. Following a significant frost, researchers and traders deploy a combination of aerial imagery and direct boots-on-the-ground assessment, walking individual farms, row by row, because frost severity can vary dramatically, even across neighboring properties, depending on elevation, slope, and proximity to water that can moderate how far temperatures actually drop overnight in any specific location. That means the full scope of a major frost event's damage often isn't known for days or even weeks after the cold itself has passed. This is a genuinely agonizing period for growers who already know, standing in their own fields the morning after, that something serious has happened, but who have to wait, sometimes for weeks, to learn the full financial scope of what they're actually facing for the coming year. So where does this leave the people actually living the story, season after season, in the highlands of Minas Gerais and beyond? The honest answer is that Brazil's coffee-growing communities are living through a genuinely difficult, ongoing period, one where each Winter now carries real, quantifiable dread rather than the more distant, occasional risk it may have represented a generation or two earlier. That's a story worth understanding the next time you see a headline about Brazilian frost driving coffee prices higher. Because behind that market movement sits a genuinely human reality. Farmers like Marcelo Paterno standing in fields they've spent their lives cultivating, watching a slow, cumulative disaster unfold in real time, one winter frost at a time. If you work anywhere in the coffee industry, or if you simply want to understand the human cost behind the price on your bag of coffee, I'd encourage you to look past just the market headlines and toward the on-the-ground reporting coming out of these specific regions during frost season, since the growers actually living through this crisis are the ones whose voices tend to get lost the fastest. Once a story becomes purely about commodity futures and price charts, I'll be watching how this winter's frost season continues to unfold across Brazil's coffee highlands, and I'll bring you the full story, including how growers on the ground are actually experiencing it the moment there's a significant development worth walking through. Subscribe so you don't miss that update, and drop a comment below if you work anywhere in the coffee industry, or if this is the first time you're hearing the human story behind a crisis that ultimately touches something as universal as a morning cup of coffee. I read every one of these, and I think stories like this one genuinely deserve more attention than they typically get, precisely because the people most affected are standing thousands of miles from most of the people who will eventually feel the consequences at a checkout counter. Stay curious about the human stories behind the headlines you scroll past, and I will see you in the next one.